Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in today's video we are going to do mass producing but with stencils. I have all of my A2 size card bases cut out, or card front panels, excuse me. They're not a card base, they're just a card front panel. I'm going to be using this Mistletoe wreath stamp set from Altenew today. I'm not using the actual stamp, I'm just using the stencils. And I thought maybe I'd use the die, but I don't end up using that either. I just use a sentiment from it and the stencils. So there are 4 stencils in this set. And what's really unique about these is that there's actual etching. So all of the stencils are numbered. There are 4 stencils, but 2 of the stencils have 2 pieces on them. So there are 6 colors you could choose if you wish to do it that way. There's a little F etched into the front to let you know that that is what actually faces you. Also very helpful. But there's etching. So stencil number 1 has the berries on it. Has one of the berries and then another set of berries. And the second set of berries actually has etching to show you where the first berries were. And then the subsequent stencils all show you where the berries are so that you can line up your stencils according to that. So I'm going to be using Altenew inks for a more traditional color palette, and then I'm going to be using some Pinkfresh Studio inks for a less traditional color palette that's a little brighter. I'm going to be using Coral Berry, Crimson, Hunter Green, Black or Green Onyx, Green Opal, and Dark Chocolate from Altenew. I'm going to be using Grassy, Knoll, Aquamarine, Buff, I think Warm Buff, and Grassy, Knoll. I can't remember the other ones, but I'll talk to you about them below, link them below. So what I've done is I want my wreath to hang off the right hand side of the paper, and so I have placed my paper in my stamp positioning tool just so that I have a right edge to help myself line things up every time. And then I also put tape, just some purple satin masking tape from Altenew. You can use any tape you have, but I used that just because it was what I had. And I just made a little corner for myself right there so that I knew where my paper went. So every time I put my paper in there, I'm going to put it right there. Every time I put my stencil in, I'm going to line my stencil up in that bottom left corner. And this just makes lining things up a lot easier. I discovered as I went along that not all of my paper is cut to the same exact size. And so I do have to do some finagling as particularly I add the layers of berries on, but that'll come later in the video. So I started with the greenery just because that was the biggest and that gave me the best idea on placement. I'm going to use, that's just a little shelf liner. It just keeps my stencils, or excuse me, my ink pads from shifting and moving around all over the place. I don't remember if I cleaned off this brush the last time I used it, so I'm just going to use my flour sack cloth and scrub off any remaining ink that was on there. And then I'm going to go ahead and get into it. This is the Hunter Green, and I believe this is stencil number 4. I wasn't particular on what leaves I wanted what color. I just knew I wanted these 3 colors because I thought they would give me really good variation. With the more non-traditional color palette, it was kind of difficult to see the difference between the layers or the different colors. It worked out fine, but I would probably, if I were going to do this again, pick a color that had more contrast between them. So this is I believe this is the Green Opal. Really beautiful, like winter foliage colors for this wreath. So that is what it looks like with just stencil 3 and 4. And like I said, I started with stencil number 4, and then I did stencil number 3. So here I'm discovering that stencil 1 and 2 are split. And so I can't use my same trick of lining things up in the corner like I did the first time for stencils 3 and 4. So I have to do some figuring. So here is all of the traditional color palette with just the 2 stencils, stencil 3 and 4. Now I'm going to move on to the less traditional color palette, which I believe is grassy knoll and, oh gosh, I can't even remember. Pear, something pear, fresh pear. That's what it is. Fresh pear and grassy knoll. So I chose these two, and I'm going to do the same thing I did. I cleaned off my stencil, and I'm just going to use stencil 3 and 4, and we're going to repeat the process all over again. And here is what all of the non-traditional color palette with stencil 3 and 4, grassy knoll, and fresh pear look like. Now I've moved on to stencil number 2, and I know that each time I'm going to have my paper lined at the bottom and off to that tape that's on the right-hand side. My stencil is always going to be all the way to the left and lined up with that tape at the top. And this just, again, helps make this mass production process a little bit faster. I don't have to line things up every single time with every stencil, every single piece of cardstock. So here, we're back to the more traditional color palette. This is green onyx from Altenew. Just a really deep, like aspen green is the best way I can describe it. So we're going to stencil this on all of the pieces, and then we're going to switch to the less traditional color palette. I just clean my stencil each time, and I do all of the same color and all of the same step for every single piece of cardstock. So here all of these are done, and I'm going to show you that I got a little overzealous with my ink blending, and some of them I got some ink outside of the stencil. We will handle that at the very end once all of the stenciling is done. So don't fret, we'll get that taken care of. So I've cleaned my stencil. I'm going to move on to the less traditional color palette, and this one I'm using aquamarine as the third foliage stencil. And I'm going to do the same process, just ink blended over through the stencil. And I get smart later on in this video, and I use a smaller ink blending tool. I took a little bit of that purple satin tape and masked off. There's a bear, I think it's the twig image, maybe it's berries, but there's another stencil up there, and so I didn't want to get wild and crazy and get my ink where I didn't want it, so I just put some of that masking tape in the way so that I wasn't going to get ink where I didn't want it. But I'm going to go through and ink blend this aquamarine all over this cardstock on all of the pieces that are the non-traditional color palette. So here I've gotten smart and I've switched to a mini ink blending tool, and I'm going to use the dark chocolate on this more traditional one from dark chocolate from Altenew on the more traditional colored one. And I discovered when I was ink blending that I really needed to go clockwise and counterclockwise, and the reason for that is I was almost getting like skipping when I was ink blending, and so using the mini ink blending tool helped me not get ink where I didn't want it, but I also was really aware of the need to go clockwise and counterclockwise. And I did this to all of the all of the more traditional ones, and then I will go back with the more non-traditional and do that again. So here is the traditional one with all of the branches done, and we're going to move on to the non-traditional. So here is the non-traditional done, and I did that with the Pinkfresh Warm Buff ink. So now we're going to start getting into the berries. So for the first layer of berries, I used the Coral Bliss for the Altenew, and this is for the more traditional one. So here it is with the Coral Bliss done. Moving on to the non-traditional, and this is the, trying to remember, Coral Berry, maybe? I'm trying to remember. But this is for the less traditional one. And so I'm just doing the same process, blending clockwise, counterclockwise, and getting these all done. And here are these with the Coral Bliss on there. And then this is the final stencil. For the more traditional one, I'm using the Crimson ink from Altenew. And again, I did my same little trick, but this is the layer where it was just as easy to kind of figure out where they all went as opposed to using those kind of tape marks I made. It was because some of my paper was not cut perfectly to size. Some of them were off a little bit. And so at this point, it was easier just to kind of freehand it. And I did do that, particularly as I kept going along. I just discovered it was easier just to line it up as opposed to use my little tape marks that I made. So this is what it looks like all done. The traditional one, and then we're moving on to the non-traditional. And for this one, this is Passion Fruit by Pinkfresh Studio, and we're going to ink blend this all over on all of the layers and move on to the next step. And this is what that one looks like, all stenciled. So remember, I got some ink where I didn't want it, and I had this on quite a few panels. So I'm just taking my mono sand eraser, the actual sanding side, and just scratching the top layer of that ink and the paper off, and it goes away really, really well, particularly the greens. I did have a spot where I had some red where I didn't want it. That didn't want to come off so easy. It's not terribly noticeable, but it is there if you look closely. I don't think the recipient is going to sit there and focus on that. If they do, that's on them. But if it really bothered you, you could try to take like a white gel pen and go over it and try to get rid of it that way. But I didn't feel like that was super necessary. So here I have all of my A2 size card bases folded, cut, and stamped with my little logo on the back. And all of these card front panels were A2 size, so they were 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, but I decided that I wanted to make them a little bit smaller. So I am trimming 1/8 of an inch from the top and the bottom, and then 1/4 of an inch from the left-hand side. So the side that does not have the wreath hanging off of it. And this is going to give me about 1/8 of an inch border on all 4 sides. And so I really like that. And we're going to do something a little different with that toward the end. So this is what it looks like with the white card base and the white panel. But if you want to have more contrast, you can, and you don't have a whole lot of colored cardstock, or maybe you don't have enough for whatever purpose you're trying to do, you can make a faux matte. So all I'm doing is I'm taking a ink pad and I am doing a direct to paper method. So I'm literally swiping this ink pad directly across the very edge of my cardstock. And this, when I put the panel on top of it, is going to look like it has been matted on a green card base, but it has not. So it doesn't look like it matches very well right now, but that ink is still really wet. And so as it dries, it'll look a lot better. So I did that to all of the ones that were, I used that Sprout ink from Simon Says Stamp, the Positively Saturated line, on all of the more non-traditional colors. And so for the more traditional colors, I'm using Cherry from the same line. And this one is super, super juicy. And I actually ended up getting some ink on the back of my, yeah, I'm not going to stress that, but one of the reasons why I'm doing this on a scrap piece of paper is because of that. So the scrap piece of paper will absorb most of that ink, whereas if I did this directly on my glass mat, it would definitely get all over the place. So I know Jennifer McGuire will quite often put a piece of like masking paper on the back of her cards to prevent that, but I don't really have masking paper, so this was just the route I went. And I think the ink only got on one of my cards, the back of them. So for the sentiment, I'm using a sentiment from that same Mistletoe wreath stamp set, and I am just using a ink pad that I used in the ink blending. So for the non-traditional one, I am using the aquamarine, And for the traditional one, I'm using the crimson, and these are the same colors that I used in the original stenciling. Now it's time to glue each of these to their card bases. So like I said, I'm using the more traditional one with the red, and I'm just going to glue these directly onto the card base. If you wanted to, you could pop this up. You could leave it flat like I did. It's more easy to mail this way. But if you're not worried about that, you could always add more dimension with foam tape or extra pieces of cardstock. This is just the way I chose to do it. And I'm just using my Misty to add some weight while this glue sets. If you wanted to step this up, I thought about this later, you could have added like nuvo drops as the berries. You could have added some glitter pin for some sparkle. You could have added gems or sequins, what have you to it. But I just decided to leave these as is. I thought they were beautiful. You could add splatter, whatever you wanted. But that's it. That is all 20 cards made. Thank you so much for joining me, and we will see you next time.